Good evening, everybody. I'm sorry, my talk is going to be much more down to earth than the introductory video, but I hope I can give you a little bit of an overview about what I think is an important health issue these days. It's about the smartphone epidemic or pandemic that is a global epidemic. And when talking about risks and side effects, let me be very clear up front, I mean very serious risks and side effects. And you would believe me, body posture problems, overweight problems, and you're probably surprised to find diabetes, hypertension, shortsightedness, sleep disorders, and high-risk behavior among the main health issues that I'm going to talk about. And just to be clear, what I mean and what I refer to, and it's not just my hunch or my gut reaction, but it's rather all I'm saying is published in the scientific literature and in the medical literature. Let me give you just an example of what I'm talking about. Myopia, short-sightedness. So we all have seen this, youngsters using digital devices. And notice they wear glasses. And that's not a coincidence. Why is this? Sorry, this is biology, 8th grade or so. This is how an eye works. And this is how an eye that is a bit too long doesn't work, and it needs a correction such that the rays will end up on the retina in focus. This is a children's eye. It's smaller than an adult eye. And when the children grow up, their eyes grow up. And it's good if they grow up to the exact size such that the image is in focus. Now we do know, and it's not long that we learned that the eyes have a built-in mechanism such that they grow exactly until the image is in focus. The problem is, if you look at close range, the rays come from here and they focus way back, okay? What happens to your eye is, if you spend a lot of time looking at close range, it gets too long. It just grows too long, okay? And once this has happened, and it happens over about the first 25 years of life, your eye is too long, and that's that. And then it's short-sighted. And we call this short-sightedness. This was published 140 years ago by a professor of ophthalmology who complained that if school kids spend too much time reading books, they will need glasses later on. And he was right. The whole thing is called school myopia, and it's no longer a problem in schools because, well, at least in Germany, adolescents spend about 15 minutes a day reading books. It is a problem, though, for example, in South Korea, where the average South Korean youngster spends about 5.4 hours on their smartphone a day, plus tablet, plus laptop, plus PlayStation, and all the other screen media. And this is a problem, and it is even a problem in Europe, where short-sightedness used to be have a frequency of about 1 to 5%. In Europe now, in the under 20-year-olds, it's 50%. That came out of a study that got published in 2015, where a lot of people just pulled their data together and found that in Europe we have 30, now it's 50% actually. In China it's 80, and in South Korea it's way over 95%. Short-sightedness in the under 20-year-olds. We call this a pandemic, which is a global epidemic. Is this an accidental problem, or, well, is it an easy-to-fix problem? At first blush it seems so. Well, we can all wear glasses on a global scale. We can do laser treatments, etc. But the problem is a bit deeper. First, we interfere with brain development because the eyes are part of the brain, and once the eyes are developed, the problem has been fixated. It's just there. By the same token, if you are over 25, you don't need to worry because your eyes are done. You need no longer worry about their development, okay? But this is causing interference with normal development when you use a small screen at a short range. The problem with the smartphone, okay, is this. It is the world's most used digital device. It is most used by every single user, up to 5 or 6 hours a day. And it's the smallest. And these three effects combined make this a global health problem. And the problem is a big one simply because once your eye is deformed, so it's not just the right shape, but a bit tweaked, okay? This increases the chances of becoming blind at old age for a number of reasons. Glaucoma, cataract, retina degeneration, and macular degeneration, and retina ablation, sorry. So these are the four main reasons for becoming blind as an older person. And myopia increases the risk of this happening. This is, by the way, the reason why China has introduced a smartphone ban across the whole country, because they have 1.3 billion Chinese times 80%, it's about 1 billion. And even if you assume a single-digit number for the development of blindness, that's still millions of blind people in a couple of decades. And the Chinese government decided, no, we don't want that. That's why they introduced a smartphone ban in all schools a couple of months ago. So adults, no action needed. But the doses makes the poison. There's no point of good watching in the right way. There's no right way. But if you look at five minutes at your smartphone a day as a baby, that doesn't matter, okay? But 5 hours certainly do matter. Sleep disorders. Just to continue and give you a flavor of what I'm talking about, okay? This happens a lot. That is, young people spend the hour before they start sleeping on their digital device. How often does that take place? Here's a study from Norway. Scandinavians are good at doing good studies, and here's one of them. And they did this in 2015 and asked about 10,000 people from 14 to 17 about their media use. And it turns out that about 90% use their smartphone in the hour before they sleep. Girls are spending more time on their cell phones, socially interacting. Boys spend more time on their game console gaming, that's seen here and here, but you still have a big problem. Why is this a problem? Because screens emit mainly blue light. The blue curve is the frequency of the light that comes from the screen, and it's mainly blue. Blue light causes your melatonin secretion, that's your sleep hormone secretion when lights go down, to stop because blue light indicates daylight. The black curve is the spectrum of daylight. Since human beings spent the last 2 million over the campfire, yellow light from fires and incandescent light bulbs doesn't hurt because that's mainly yellow and red. But we have developed a blue light receptor in our eyes with which we don't see, but that goes directly to the internal clock and the hormonal glands that are controlled by that. And so we wreak havoc to our sleep by watching a blue screen or a smartphone screen at night. There's a technical fix, I know, night shift, that you can activate and dampen down the blue light, but this is only a technical fix for the blue light, simply because sometimes emotional things in social networks and also in games happen, and they will stop you from having a good night's sleep either. And so the technical fix doesn't work for change of your Facebook status. There is no technical fix for that. So is there a problem? Yes, there is. There are sleep lab studies, and they clearly show the more you use your digital device the day before, the less you sleep. It's an effect that can be up to 2 hours. This affects every age. And again, there's no looking the right way. The timing is the poison, late in the evening. And so there should be no color screens after dinner if you really take this seriously. And the effect still is most important in children and adolescents, simply because they are learning. And when they go to school in the morning and they have slept 2 hours too little, then they have a big problem. At least in Germany, this is a problem. The average person who goes out of high school in Germany and has the Abitur, the German maturity, doesn't know how to do fractions or percentages. and has a good grade in math. So education really went down in Germany, and it's well known, and it's a big problem. There are other problems, like diabetes and hypertension. Sleeplessness is a risk factor for diabetes. And diabetes is a risk factor for heart attacks and strokes, which is the #1 cause of mortality in the civilized Western world. So if you increase the #1 cause of mortality by just a fraction, that's still a lot of dead people, which is why sleeplessness and sleeplessness cause diabetes, and diabetes causes stroke and heart attack is a big problem, a big number problem. Hypertension, same thing. You may say, I've never heard about this thing making hypertension. Well, it increases the odds. How do we know? Well, we have lab studies. Came out in 2015. This is when the smartphone rings, pulse rate, heart rate goes up, and blood pressure goes up in the lab. And you may say, well, this is just a lab that doesn't count in the real world. Well, we have real world data just as well. This is an American school nurse who took blood pressure in 231 school kids and asked them, how much time do you spend on the internet per week? And those who spent 4 hours had about a 7% increased risk of a high blood pressure, and those who spent more than about 25 hours on average on the internet per week had about almost 20% risk of high blood pressure. So here you can say, oh, well, this is just a correlation. Yes, it doesn't tell you cause and effect. Yes, the lab study shows you cause and effect, but it is an artificial situation. So you can't say, well, this is the real world. No, it is not, it's the lab. But once you have the lab study establishing cause and effect, and you have real-world data showing that there is a correlation, you have both. You have causality and you have an effect in the real world. And that is a concern. Because, again, if you add the odds, and if you add only a few percentage points to the odds of having hypertension, this is a big problem in these kids who are 14 to 17-year-olds. I'm an old man. If I get high blood pressure now, I needn't worry, because it takes decades for the side effects like kidney failure, stroke, heart attack, blindness, peripheral problems, you get your leg amputated eventually, etc., etc. So they're all bad things that happen with your high blood pressure. I needn't worry because it takes decades for them to develop. These kids have all reason to worry because they have a few decades, well, 5 to 7, to live, and they will develop all the side effects you find in the textbooks, which is why this is a problem. Well, did you know that this has surpassed alcohol as the #1 cause of traffic accidents on the roads in developed countries at the younger people? In Germany, we used to have road signs on the Autobahn, don't mix drinking and driving, etc. Now we have, don't use your smartphone. Tip, tip, death. It's the text, okay? So, and it's not just high-risk behavior on the streets, it's also high-risk behavior, for example, when it comes to sex. Tinder makes about 15 million casual sexual relations a day. 15 million a day. Well, I know in Denmark that's looked at the bright side of life. To a doctor, it has a downside. And the downside is that we now have studies clearly showing that the use of these geosocial networking, hooking up devices clearly correlates with the increasing frequency of sexually transmitted diseases on a global scale. And I'm not kidding. It's simply a fact that we have these diseases on a global scale going up and up and up, no matter what disease you look at. I'm a psychiatrist by training, and here are some of the side effects in my field that I know even better than the field of general medicine. Addiction, aggression, anxiety, depression, decreased empathy, and decreased life satisfaction. Let me go into a little bit of this. Did you know that Facebook use predicts declines in subjective well-being in young adults? This is a study that came out a couple of years ago in quite a few people, and it was shown that you go into Facebook and then you are depressed. And it's not the other way around. It's not that the depressed people are in Facebook. No, you're first in Facebook and then you are depressed. And if you happen to have this going on for a while, you are less satisfied with your life. And this is a scientific study. Does that translate into, well, the real world? Yes, it does. A large scale in the UK has shown that 13-year-old girls who spend more than 3 hours in Facebook a day have double the probability to be depressed at 18. Since depression in young girls is one of the major problems, it's one of the health problems, from the 10 most important health problems, 4 are within the realm of psychiatry, and depression is one of them. So doubling what is a big risk anyway is a big thing. And again, I'm talking not about a few depressed girls, I'm talking about huge numbers of people. A study from the US is even clearer in what it tells you. What Jean Twenge did, she looked at suicide rates over almost a decade, and she found that suicide rates in young men went up 30%, whereas suicide rates in young women in the US during 7 years doubled. I'm talking about suicide and the doubling of suicides. And suicide is the second or third most frequent cause of death at that age range. So again, I'm not talking about a few corpses. I'm talking about thousands of dead people. And then she also looked in this study on more than 500,000 13 to 18-year-olds, and she looked at their suicidal ideation, which is something psychiatrists do on a daily basis, so I know exactly. I could go into this in great length. I don't. My point is you can find out the risk of somebody committing suicide by talking to this person and asking specific questions. When you do this, and then you ask how much time do you spend using digital devices, you find a very clear correlation. So this is the number of hours spending using digital devices, and this is suicidal ideation. This is just a correlation, yes, and not everybody who thinks of suicide commits it. In fact, only a tiny fraction does. But changing these probabilities obviously changes the suicide rate, which again doubled within 7 years in young women in the US, where these data are from. And again, you might say, well, it's poverty and it's socioeconomics and it's other reasons. Well, they measured a few other variables, and if you take them into account, you get one of the curves. If you leave them out, you get the other curve. So what you can see here, it's not about this other stuff. It's about digital media use and actual suicide. Decreased empathy. Let me get this across as a side. Humans have empathy, but they don't have them, by just being humans. Just as we don't walk as being humans, we have to learn that. And just as we don't talk as we are human beings, because we have to learn how to talk. And there is lots of talk around us, and we do a lot of talk, and then we know how to do this. Same thing with empathy. We do have parts of our brains that can learn how to decode, language melody or facial expression or habit or motion in terms of the emotional content. But we have to use these brain areas and decode thousands and thousands of times, and then we know that somebody is not feeling too well before the person even starts to talk, because we see it. And this is what we call empathy. And again, it has to be learned by thousands and thousands of social encounters. What happens if you outsource your social life onto a screen? Well, you don't have real encounters where you have real emotional interaction. By the way, medium is a name for something in between. So medium is between you and me. And social interaction, by definition, is with nothing between us. Like now, I'm talking to you, and you're there, and I'm here, and there's no screen or wall or whatever. There's nothing between us. The immediacy is a defining feature of social interactions. And media is not immediate, it is mediate. which is social media is something like a married bachelor, a contradiction in terms. You need to think about this. And if you realize that, one thing is clear. You cannot develop empathy in front of a screen. And in fact, this is known for almost a decade. These are the best longitudinal data on this issue that we have on the globe. Actually, 2 longitudinal developmental studies have been put together, and this is about 4,000 adolescents, and it has been found that the more screen media use they have on a daily basis, you add it up, the less empathy these young people have for their parents and their peers. We have more studies. This study where empathy and social cognition is measured, was measured over decades, you find a decline, in particular in the last decade. Is this academic? No. Let me show you 2 pictures from a German tabloid, actually the highest circulation German tabloid, the Bild-Zeitung, and this is one of them. A 32-year-old man, so the story goes, lay in front of a cash machine, and the first 4 people who got cash stepped over the man, got their cash, and stepped over the man back and left. And the 3rd person helped the man. The man died next day because the help was too late. So people stepping over a person laying there in need of help, obviously, not helping. This is not good, and a sign of a lack of empathy. But there are worse things happening. This is another example from the German tablet. There was a biker who had a motorbike accident and he was dying. And there was a passerby who took his smartphone and filmed the dying person and put the film online. By now, we are about to introduce a law in Germany. The law has the following content: you must not film a dying person. This tells you how morally decayed Germans are. It's shocking, isn't it? I mean, we had cameras for 100 years, and we didn't film dying people. And now we do, simply because there has been a decline of our feelings for other people. And I gave this talk in Italy, and I said, well, this is Germany, and the Italians said, well, we have the same thing. And this is not just one example. This happens on a daily basis, policemen will tell you. So, to me, I don't want to live in a world of zombies, I have to say. So for me, this is a really depressing issue that our culture has gadgets that take away empathy from people when it develops. And once it hasn't developed, it won't develop because there are critical windows for development, which is really a sad thing. Addiction. South Korea, the #1 maker of smartphones, had a rate of addiction in youngsters of 30%. And they said, we can no longer afford this. So they introduced legislation, and it's the only country on the globe where they did this. Basically, if you buy a smartphone and you are not an adult yet, there has to be software installed that limits your use. And if you overuse it, your parents get notified automatically. You can't access games at night, and you can't access pornography. So this is the attempt of a country that is #1 producer of smartphones to try to come to grips with the side effects of smartphones in their young generation. Let me add, they had 95% of shortsightedness also. And of course, all the other things that I'm talking about. Okay. Is there something like smartphone addiction? Still people debate this, but you no longer need to debate it because the World Health Organization has made it official that internet device use and internet gaming is actually addictive, and there can be an addiction of that type. We know of non-substance addictions for quite some time. The one-armed man or the gaming addiction is one, and now we have digital media addiction, computer addiction, smartphone addiction on top of that. And just to make this clear, the reason is that not only the clinical features are the same, the neuroscience is also the same. We used to have pictures of cocaine addiction. This is actually the first picture that was done of cocaine addicts when they were in a scanner on cold turkey, and then they got a shot of cocaine. And the control condition was a shot of saline. And this is what happens in cocaine addicts' brains if you give them a shot of cocaine. There's a brain area, we call it the nucleus accumbens, that lights up. This is not our cocaine addiction center, to make this very clear, because many of you will not be cocaine addicts, and all of you have this brain area. It is not our cocaine addiction center. We know by now it's a learning, motivation, and good feeling center, but its purpose is to make us seek out new and important information and sort the wheat from the chaff and the boring. Whenever we meet boring stuff, it's not going on. But if it's interesting, it lights up and makes us learn faster. That's the reason why this exists. It can be hijacked by drugs, but not only by drugs. This is a study that was published 3 years ago, and this shows you the score on the Facebook addiction scale of people who use Facebook a lot, and the increase when you show the F of Facebook in the scanner of these people in these areas. So you can clearly see a correlation between Facebook addiction and the response of the very same centers that also respond to cocaine. So one is Facebook, one is cocaine. And what you see here is the addict's response. To conclude that there is at least an overlap is the least you can do. Education. I'm not just talking health, I'm talking education as well. I've found a center of education and learning 1.5 decades ago. So one of the things I'm really interested in is education. Let me be very clear on this. Digital media wreak havoc to education of young people. And there's not a single study on the globe showing that they do any good in education. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of studies showing that it's not good, for a number of reasons. One is attention. Big Chinese study, the more time you spend on your smartphone, the more likely you are to suffer from attention deficit disorder. Funny study, what happens if your smartphone sits here and rings and you are just engaged in a task? Turns out your memory and your attention on this task goes down. Another study, that one was 10 years old, this one is 1 year old. And it asks the question, what happens if your smartphone sits here and doesn't do anything? And the comparison condition is the smartphone is in the adjacent room, or it's down in your bag. And what you do is you do a task of thinking ability, they did a working memory task, or they did actually an on-screen IQ test. For those of you in the know, Raven's matrices, it's a culture-free IQ test. So here's what comes out. On the left, it's the results from the thinking, the working memory task. And the highest column is having your smartphone in the adjacent room. You're doing best. You're doing worse if your smartphone is down in your bag. And you're doing worse if your smartphone sits on your table. And on the right, you see IQ. So if you put your smartphone on your table, even if it doesn't do anything, it just sits here, it reduces IQ by about 5 to 7 percentage points, which is the difference between a gymnasium and a middle school in Germany. So it's actually quite a big difference. One IQ point is about $20,000 earnings per lifetime, so it's about $100,000 at least. That is the difference between your smartphone on your table or in the next room. Decreased learning. Well, learning is not just what happens at school. Learning is using your brain, thereby changing it. That's the most important fact from neuroscience over the last 40 years. Up there is no CPU that crunches numbers, and there is no hard drive that stores whatever information there is. Up there are 100 billion neurons. They talk to each other, and this crosstalk changes their connectivity, and that is the memory. So the processing is identical with the memory, and the memory is identical with the processing. That's important, because if you don't do anything wrong with the processing, and I am saying digital media take away some of the processing, or they give you the wrong input for developing brains, so processing cannot take place as well as it used to, then you get a decline in cognitive development, which is exactly what you find out if you study this. This came out in January 2019. They looked for screen time in 2-, 3-, and 5-year-olds, and they did a developmental task, like an IQ, but you can't do IQ at that age, so they have a sort of IQ. So they looked at mental development. This was the result, and these look terrible, but if you look closely, I walk you through. This is screen media use at 2 years, and this is cognitive performance at 3 years, and you see an error, and the sign is negative. And it is a straight line, it's not a dotted line, so it's statistically significant. So you do get a negative effect of screen media use a year later. You don't get it this way. So it's not that the dumper kids watch more media. No, it's watching media making your kid dump. Same thing happens from 3-year-old media use to 5-year-old mental capabilities. So you have a clear time effect that media use now makes cognitive development declining later on. This is 2- to 5-year-olds. This is 8- to 11-year-olds. Another study from on 4,500 people from 21 sites in the US, done about 2 years ago, and they looked at sleep. How much do the kids sleep? How much physical activity do they get? And how much screen media use do they have? And it comes out, sleep has about such an effect of cognitive development. So it's a good effect. Physical activity, and this was a bit of a shock, had only a small but a positive effect on cognitive development. Screen media had a negative effect, and compared to these was about this size. So you have a huge effect of screen media use on cognitive development in people in elementary school age. We have more studies on this. I'm just showing you the most recent or the best, or both. I can also go into detail why this is the case. The Americans think it's great that their kids use digital screen media before they walk or talk. But let me be very clear. If you use your hand to swipe across a featureless surface with always the same motion, what you do not get is discriminative representations in your motor areas or your tactile areas for different things. I mean, a glass feels different from a table, and glass feels different from wood. And I can handle this thing in a certain way. And if I had a cup, I would handle it this way. And these sensory motor patterns of use become part of our thinking. We know this by now. There's great neuroscience about embodiment of thinking, which is basically about the sensory motor aspects determining our thoughts and actually helping our thoughts coming about and speeding up our thoughts. Which is why it's so important that kids learn how to use, well, a needle, a pen, a key, hold an egg, hold a bucket, or hold on to something with ease when they are 4. And they can do this with ease when they are 4. Actually, this is my daughter when she was 4, and I had her doing this, and she laughed and did it. And but you can't develop these skills not interacting with anything, like in this setup, okay? This is called Activity Center, and you can get the apps for free, and or same thing for this. To make this point very clear, think about the advertisement for these things. Hey parents, didn't you know that your kid spends, 1-year-old spends a lot of time wasting for toilet training? Couldn't you use a bit of that time for learning, education, and great scientific experiences? So how about a baby toilet with an iPad holder? And which is this, it costs 36 euros. And you get the apps for free. But notice, a kid at that age won't benefit from an iPad interaction at all. In fact, it needs discriminative learning and not do this, because this is not educational for your sensory and motor learning that you do at that age. The higher level cognitive areas, first, they don't have any connection to the outside world. They need to be getting their information from sensory and motor areas. But what if there is no discriminative information in those areas because they only did this with their hands? This is a crime. Giving out screen media in kindergarten and elementary school is a big obstacle to the development of kids. It is not educational at all. It is a big impairment of any learning in these kids, and you should realize that. How come nobody knows this? Well, because we have the biggest companies on earth. They are the richest on earth: Apple, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, and they live on you not knowing this and giving out this stuff. You have to realize this. The tobacco lobby also caused a lot of deaths in the last couple of decades. In Germany, 140,000 a year, times about 50 years. That's 7 million dead people by the tobacco lobby in Germany. But this is small beer compared to what I told you about the smartphone effects. Because if you add it up, and there's a lot more to add up, it's a lot. And I'm very serious about this. And by the way, the most important subjects in school, preschool and elementary school, and this is not romantic pedagogy that came out in Science magazine, if you want to read for yourself, is music, sports, theater, pretense play, we call this, handiwork. And these are the important subjects. It just happens that these are cut down and most often get cut out completely out of the curriculum, at least in Germany. I'm sure Denmark is better, so make sure Denmark is better. We do know that cell phones are not good for your academic career. Here's one study: relationship between cell phone use, academic performance, and anxiety and satisfaction with life. The more you use your smartphone, the less well your academic career goes, the more anxiety you have, and the less satisfied with your life. Decreased knowledge. This is just a summary study that came out more than 2 years ago, showing that students are better off without a laptop in the classroom. Well, we know this. Why? Well, for example, here. They did a study where they had a new course and about 100 kids, 15 or so. And they taught the course for 22-hour lessons. And the course was completely computerized. Like everyone had a laptop, and they could go to the internet, could do classwork, and the course was taught by teachers referring to the computer, and sometimes not, and it was a digitized school, just like we in Germany now spend 5 billion to introduce across the country. I'm serious. A few days ago, we started to invest 5 billion over the next couple of years to digitize all the schools, that is, to put wireless LAN in every classroom and to give digital devices into every classroom. So if you do that and then you do school, and at the end of the course, they actually did a test. Okay, what happens is this. 34% of the time, the kids spent, because the server was rigged such that it took note what the kids were doing. And 34% of the time of the entire school time in this course was spent with non-curricular activities. That is, the kids spent time using Facebook, shopping, reading email, chatting, reading news and sports, watching videos and playing games. And every single activity correlated negatively with the exam scores, which is not surprising. If you don't do schoolwork here, you learn less, which is what came out. But there was a second interesting outcome from this study. They also looked at how much time do kids spend on curricular issues at the computer. And then they looked at the correlation of this time spent for the course material on the computer and the outcome in the exam, and the correlation was 0. So those who spent more time learning with the computer did not do better. So if computers in schools were a pill against stupidity, and you sent in the studies to the FDA and you want approval for its use, You would get back no way to approve this because it has a lot of side effects and no effect. But we now spend 5 billion, and you can see, I cannot tell you this without getting something emotional. I do get emotional about this. This is another study from West Point Military Academy. The point is, these are all highly motivated young people who pay high fees to get into one of the best schools and get a good education. And the school thought about digitizing their curriculum. Before they did that, they thought, let's do an experiment. We have 50 classes, or 15 students and professors. And what we can do is we can randomize. And they did this. This is the study design. So they randomized 50 classes. And 1/3 got a laptop and a tablet. 1/3 got a tablet only, 1/3 got nothing. And then they did a whole semester, they did many exams, and then they looked at the outcome. And the outcome was very clear. Those who didn't get anything were doing about 20% better than the other two groups. 20% in highly motivated people. The authors write, in less motivated people, the effect's going to be bigger. So this study is less than 2-year-olds. Here's yet another study. You know the PISA data, they're gathering for now 2 decades, data on 15-year-olds, and what they basically do is look at what happens when they are 15, how good are they in math, sciences, natural sciences, and spelling and writing. And here let's look at the math. And the chief of the PISA enterprise, he basically analyzed a decade worth of data from more than 50 countries. And each country has, tens of thousands of 15-year-olds doing a similar test every couple of years. And he looked at, did they get better or worse over the decade? So what you have here is a graph. And the graph has here a deviation from the start. So did kids get better or worse in the last 10 years from this country? And then on this axis, you have how much did the government of this country spend on digitization of school per capita, that is per school kid, during this time. For example, Australia spent in 2008 $2.4 billion Australian dollars on the digitization of schools. So they really took a lot of money and spent it in 2008. So Australia is one of the countries that you can see here. And if school digitization would bring something good, you would expect something like this. The more you spend on digital media, the better your kids get. And this is the real data. This, again, is data from 50 countries over 10 years on millions of 15-year-olds. And the correlation is about 0.5. That is, the more government spend on digital media in schools on 15-year-olds, the less they learn. So now I've shown you evidence from basically early age on till 15. Now let me give you finally a study. What happens, this is British economists, if you ban mobile phones in schools? And in the greater London area, they found 90 schools who between 2002 and 2012 got introduced a smartphone ban at the school. They got the school grades of the 130,000 plus school kids in these 90 schools. In the year after the smartphone ban and the 5 years after and the 5 years before the ban. So now let's look at the average of 130,000 school kids from the day, this is the midpoint, 0 point, the day the smartphone ban was introduced. And again, this was sometime between 2002 and 2012. That is, any school reform, any political motion, anything that got introduced kind of smears out because it happened sometime in some schools. But you have one thing that all the schools have in common at point 0, no smartphones allowed at that point from that point onward. And what you can clearly see, they are getting better and better and better, and the effect is significant in the first year. They could do with so many kids' data, they could do subgroup analysis, and they did a great thing. They looked at the results from the 20% least advanced kids, the 20% not so good, the middle 20, the good 20, and the very good 20%. And the outcome is this. The very good kids don't change when you take away their smartphones in schools. But the worse the kids performed before, the better they got. Which parallels other studies showing that if you give out digital devices in schools, the not so good kids get the worst outcome. The good kids don't change much. But you hurt the kids that are vulnerable in the first place most. It is often claimed, well, we have this digital divide and we have the haves and the have-nots and we must close the gap between the rich and the poor, and the way to do this is digitization, because then we have access to wisdom by anybody. This is ideologically driven nonsense, not backed up by any data. And the data just tell you the opposite. You hurt the have-nots most by introducing digital media. More dementia. I got a lot of critique when I published a book called Digital Dementia, out in Danish for a year by now, and out in 20 languages. And people said, well, this is a stupid Dr. Spitzer. How can you say digital dementia? We have digital media and smartphones now for... Whoops. Doesn't want to do anything. Well, it does. Back, yes. So let me give you the story very briefly. Dementia is not a medical diagnosis, but a descriptive term. It means literally demens, that is, down with your mind. And it happens at old age for dozens of reasons. Neurons dying of, when there are infarctions, when there is Alzheimer's, there is junk that lies around here and kills off neurons, and there's other reasons for mental decline. It's basically dying neurons for whatever reason gives you mental decline. But for every descent, there's a simple truism: the higher you start, the longer it takes you to get down. The same thing is true for dementia. So, and let me make this very clear. If you don't want to get dementia, what can you do? Well, people talk about this a lot, and you can eat blueberries, yes. You can eat broccoli, yes. You can do jogging, great. But there's one thing that's the best predictor of not getting dementia at old age. And that is the educational level you attained as a kid and an adolescent. So your brain training you got early on in your life basically decides how high you are from where you are descending, okay? So when you go to school, you basically do dementia prophylaxis. You didn't know that, but it's a matter of fact, and in fact it's in all books, textbooks about dementia. Just read what's the biggest protective factor. It's your educational attainment at young age. So if you wreak havoc to your educational attainment, and I've given you the data on this just before, one thing is clear. The more digital media use you have at young age, think of cognitive development, at 2, 3, 4, 8, 12, 15, no matter where it was looked, always the same thing, down, okay? And if you add this up, you get a huge effect. If you want this in dollars, it's actually mind-boggling. The financial crisis of 2007 was cheap. When you look at what this wave of dementia that is going to come is going to cost. We have more on this thing. Oh, it does work a bit. If you want to read about more, the Science magazine, 2011. People from Harvard and Columbia published a study where they did a very simple thing. They gave information to people, 5 different groups, via books, journals, newspapers, or Google, and always found the same thing. When you Google something, the likelihood that it sticks in here is least. So books are good for learning. Google is not. And it's not me saying it. It comes out in Science magazine about 8 years ago. Electronic textbooks, not so good. Again, Science magazine. By now we have a meta-analysis of several hundred studies showing if you read from screens, less sticks in here compared to read from books. And if that was what they showed, if you add the bells and whistles that are possible with digitization, so you don't just put a PDF on a screen, no. You take a photo and put a video in it instead of a photo. And instead of references, no one looks them up anyway. You put in hyperlinks. You click on them, you're right there. If you do this, that is, using the digital media, whatever they can do, learning gets worse. So the most digitized textbooks have the least learning. The reason is very simple. If you read, a lot of stuff goes on in here. If you click, not. So reading is educational, clicking is not. And whatever leads you to click is not educational, actually will make your grades worse. Because brains don't download, they are used, and the more you use them, well, the better they end up, the higher, the more capable they end up. And because there is no difference between processing and storage, let me add one thing. If you know a language and you learn a second one, you have quite a bit to do. If you know 5 languages and learn the 6th one, it's easier. You know this. And everybody knows this. Or did you ever meet a person saying, well, you know, I know 5 languages. By now my language centers are full? No. And the reason is interesting. Because, well, you're born with your language centers. But by learning a language, they get connections and they are trained up, and this is why they know this language. And then they learn another one, and they get more connections. And if you know 5 languages, you have most intricate connections in your language centers, which enable you to process language better than if you have only a few connections. Which is why the more languages you know, the easier it is to learn another one. And it never gets full. There are people who know 50 languages and they learn the 51st in 6 to 8 weeks. Not possible to use 6 years for every language because you need to get to 300. No one does that. Okay, so you really get faster and faster the more languages you know. And this is the same thing with musical instruments, with mathematics, with anything. It has an interesting consequence. The hard drive, when it's 50% full, it has 50% capacity left. When it's 95% full, it has 5% capacity left. This is not a hard drive and doesn't work like a hard drive. This is a neural network comprised of 100 billion neurons and 1 million billion connections. And the more of this have been used and formed the right way by a good brain development from birth till about 25, the better the thing works. And you can wreak havoc to this by using this, because it is causing addiction and it's impairing brain development. Like alcohol. Not even in Germany, the beer and wine country, okay? We don't do alcohol competency training in kindergarten and school, just to get our kids used to alcohol. But they talk a lot about media competency training in kindergarten at school, even though this thing, again, causes addiction and impairs brain development just as well. So what we can do is make sure that we act responsibly. And that entails make sure that if you have a small kid, you're not using the smartphone in front of your kid, just as you don't get drunk in front of your kid and don't use crack in front of your kid. You can do more. You can really make sure I'm almost finished with the preface of my talk, but let me finish with the end of my talk. Risks and side effects. Education, society, I didn't go into this, but to sum up, digital IT comes with risks and side effects, and I've just shown them to you. They're big. And I'm not kidding by saying the tobacco lobby compared to the digital lobby is this big. And the effect of tobacco compared to effects of this is this big. I'm serious. This is much bigger in terms of health and education.
And we are constantly brainwashed by a lobby that puts out, well, digital is great, digital is the future, we have to go with this, and if we don't, we get left behind, etc., etc. You know this. It's all fake news and hype. The damage is most seriously done in the developing brain, that is, in kids. And we must not sacrifice the health and the education of our kids, our most precious resource and our future, to the profit interests of the richest companies on earth. Therefore, we should act responsibly. And digital IT sure is a great tool we all use. It takes away mental effort, which is why mental workers use it, which is why you don't learn using it. Learning is mental effort and change of the brain by these efforts. So we have to use digital media wisely so that we all benefit from digital media and not just a handful of billionaires. Please take note, and thanks for listening.